Resuming debate. Reprise du débat. L'honorable député, the honourable member from St. Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on Motion 86, a motion that calls on the government to establish a citizens' assembly on electoral reform. While I appreciate the spirit in which this motion has been put forward by the honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith, I'm unable to support it for reasons that I will set out. I would acknowledge, Mr. Speaker, that a citizens' assembly can play a constructive role in making recommendations around alternative electoral systems. After all, a citizens' assembly is comprised of private citizens who are selected randomly as part of a lottery process who are nonpartisan. Accordingly, a citizens' assembly is well positioned to consult, to deliberate, and to design alternative electoral systems. Indeed, citizens' assemblies have played precisely this role twice in Canada, in British Columbia and in Ontario in 2004 and 2006, respectively. However, that is not precisely what this motion calls for. Rather, this motion calls for the establishment of a citizens' assembly with a mandate to, quote, determine if electoral reform is recommended for Canada, and if so, to recommend specific measures that would foster a healthier democracy. And so, based on the wording of the motion, if the Citizens' Assembly determined that electoral reform were desirable, presumably it would go about making recommendations on alternative systems, but the wording on its face is somewhat ambiguous. It isn't clear. But what is clear is what is missing from the motion, and that is any mention that there be a referendum of Canadians to decide whether to adopt any new electoral system. Mr. Speaker, a citizens' assembly on its own is completely insufficient to determine any new electoral system. Likewise, I would submit it would be inappropriate for politicians to make such a determination, for example, by way of a bill introduced in Parliament, having regard for the fact that all of us have partisan political interests that would influence decisions around the design of any new electoral system. Nothing short of a referendum will suffice. A referendum is needed in order that any new electoral system have the moral weight and legitimacy that would be needed. Indeed, anything less would likely cast doubts amongst segments of Canadians that certain partisan actors had taken advantage or manipulated the electoral system for partisan or ideological gain, which would undermine democracy and undermine confidence in any new electoral system. And so, Mr. Speaker, I cannot support the motion on that basis. I cannot support a motion that could be construed as recommending a process whereby a citizens' assembly on its own would determine a new electoral system as opposed to merely recommending alternative electoral systems. Now, with that, I would like to make a few observations more broadly on the matter of electoral reform. Proponents of this motion make the case that this is something that Canadians want. Indeed, within the motion itself, there is a poll that is cited that indicates a sizable percentage of Canadians would like to see a citizens' assembly. I would respectfully question whether this is something that Canadians want, and I question it not on the basis of a poll. I base it on results of votes of Canadians in 7 referendums held over the past 20 years in 3 provinces. In 5 out of 7 referendums, Canadians, when given the choice, have voted against electoral reform and in favor of the status quo first-past-the-post system. Indeed, the only referendum in which a clear majority of voters elected to adopt a new electoral system was in the 2005 referendum in British Columbia, which 57% of voters gave the green light for electoral reform, but it didn't meet the threshold for implementation. There were 2 subsequent referendums in British Columbia in which more than 60% of voters opted for the status quo. And although it may be unfashionable to say, perhaps the reason voters have opted for the status quo is because the first-past-the-post electoral system has served Canadian democracy well. There are many merits to the first-past-the-post electoral system, including the fact that it is straightforward. It can best be summed up as the candidate with the most votes wins. What could be more straightforward than that? It is also inherently democratic. It is based on the premise that each voter is equal. One person, one vote, with each vote weighted equally. That is in contrast to alternative systems where some votes count more than once, based on second and third ballot choices, for example. As former Prime Minister, current Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, observed in a column that he wrote in The Telegraph in 2011, the first-past-the-post system produces winners, whereas alternative voting systems in some instances produce winners out of losers, in the sense that candidates who in some instances place second or third out of first ballot rankings end up winning. Further, Mr. Speaker, first-past-the-post is efficient and transparent. It tends to produce decisive results. Canadians learn, more or less on election night, what kind of government they're going to get. That is in contrast to many European countries where governments are formed weeks, sometimes months, after an election night. That is not efficient, that isn't transparent, and I would submit it isn't democratic. And first-past-the-post ensures accountability. It is heavy on accountability. When Canadians decide that it is time for a change, time to change a government, first-past-the-post tends to produce such an outcome. And it provides accountability by connecting members of Parliament with their electors, their constituents. That is in contrast to other electoral systems where, for example, members are elected based on being on a party list. And so, Mr. Speaker, those are just some of the many reasons why first-past-the-post system is a system that has worked. I would submit that it isn't by accident that Canada is one of the most stable and strongest democracies in the world. I don't think it is an accident that we have seen for more than 150 years the peaceful transfer of power. Very simply, Mr. Speaker, if the system isn't broken, then there's no need to fix it.